As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. We have a distinguished returning guest tonight, Dr. Arthur T. Bradley, author of the Disaster Preparedness Handbook. He's also a NASA scientist, an expert on electromagnetic pulse, EMP, and other preparedness topics. He's here with us tonight to talk about the everyday, most practical approach to total preparedness for a family and for a household. Dr. Bradley, thank you for joining us here again on Reluctant Preppers.
Sure, thanks for having me.
In your search of how to be help people to be more prepared, you've established a website for that. You've written multiple books, numerous articles, and if you could just give us your philosophy initially on why bother preparing at all.
Sure. So that's sort of where I started at in the book was, to see if we could answer that question, because I think it's sort of probably the most important question of all. When you go in to do anything that's going to cost you money and time, sort of ask if it's worth the trouble. And the truth of it is, for many people, they sort of silently decide that it's not worth the trouble. That's why they don't do it. And my argument goes as follows: is that even as we watch, Hurricane Matthew approaching Florida, I'm sure those folks down there see the need for preparedness. It's sort of a world we live in where, most of the time everything is quiet and safe and fairly stable in our daily lives, at least. And then when it's not, right? And those are the times when people who have sort of prepared ahead of time, you sort of get to reap the benefits of those preparations. So what I always tell people is that, we live in a world where anything can happen. And if you accept that, then you sort of go forward and say, all right, if I accept that anything around me can happen and there are dangers that can kill me, I don't think that's without a doubt, then what is it I can do and what is it I should do as sort of a responsible person on this planet to keep myself safe and keep my family safe? I'll start there and say, all right, it's all about responsibility. It's all about, sort of your own self-survival as well as the love that you have for your family and friends, and sort of taking steps to ensure your safety.
So what do you say to help people get over the hump where they're concerned that people's attitude will be tainted if they let them know that they're interested in preparedness, heaven forbid, call themselves a prepper outright? How do they keep people from thinking they're a kook?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think if you go, in a group of just sort of everyday people, everyday Americans anyway, and you start saying things like, oh, I'm a prepper, certain images come to mind, right? And certainly like doomsday prepper shows and things like that haven't done that any favors, because they take something that is really more for entertainment factor, to an extreme, which makes it entertaining. When most people who say, they're interested in disaster preparedness or they're a prepper, if they want to call themselves that, they're really just saying, hey, I'm going to take some steps to try and be, ready for whatever kind of comes my way. But it doesn't mean that they've checked out of modern society and that they're living in some bunker somewhere or anything like that. It might mean nothing more than they've got some things in the trunk of their car in case they should have to evacuate, or maybe they've stored a little extra food in their home or something like that. So, what I do, I go and give talks around the nation, and one of the first things I have the audience do is I have them raise their hands up in the air, and everybody sort of holler out together, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. And the reason I do that is to sort of realize just how silly you can get, right? And that's not what we're really about. We're trying to sort of take practical steps that, real world steps that are going to be useful to people and, help to keep them safe.
Well, right. So what kind of disasters are we talking about?
Yeah, so, there's all kinds of them. I tried to lump them into 5 categories, and I'm sure other people could lump them different ways. But I'll talk through those 5. So the first one are natural disasters, and something like Hurricane Matthew is an example of that. But earthquakes, floods, freezes, solar storms, anything essentially of our planet or our universe itself just trying to kill us off, right? And there's all kinds of things on this planet that try and kill us. So that's our natural disasters, and in fact, those are the most devastating, typically, of the disasters that we face. The next one is pandemics, and we hear a lot about that in the last probably 5 to 10 years. This year, of course, it's Zika. The year before it was Ebola. We had the scare there, and then before that it was H1N1, which was the swine flu, and then before that the avian flu and SARS, and you can go on down the list. Everything every couple of years, there's always a new one. And of all of the list of disasters, pandemics are probably at my top of my worry list. just because they can spread very quickly, and by the time science and medicine can catch up to them, they could really wreak havoc on our planet. So that's the second category. The third one are man-made disasters, which these are the things that essentially we as a technological society have kind of brought upon ourselves. So things like electrical blackouts, the air pollution that's all over the planet, house fires, food and water contamination, things like what Flint, Michigan is suffering from. So the things that sort of break down in our infrastructures that cause us, either harm or at least inconvenience at the very least. The fourth one
Well,
is,
before you go off of that one, that made me think when you said infrastructure, one of our recent first-time guests, Brad Harris from Full Spectrum Survival, it has a section of his program where he not only watches for seismic activity around the world through various data feeds and that sort of thing, but also especially where those come close to nuclear facilities, and talking about the residual nuclear releases that are still happening from the Fukushima reactor meltdown in Japan, et cetera. So that's another part of that whole infrastructure risk that you're talking about.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, the threat of the nuclear release is something I looked into recently actually it was for a fiction book, but I really wanted to have the answer straight. And so I actually interviewed one of the guys who helps run a nuclear plant here in the United States and got a lot of the facts. And, of course, his view was, it's very safe. There's redundancy upon redundancy. But if you picked at it hard enough, you could come up with scenarios where things went wrong, terribly wrong, like Fukushima, and he could explain how that happened. But you're absolutely right. I mean, those are really like global time bombs. There's about 100 nuclear reactors in the United States operating. And those are like 100 time bombs sitting in the United States that if things went terribly wrong, a sequence of things went terribly wrong, we could have a very major catastrophe that you couldn't put back in the bottle. I mean, those things don't get fixed very easily. So you're right. You're absolutely right. Beyond the man-made ones, I sort of lump war, terrorism, and crime all together. And we see that, I would say, daily on the news, between, attacks at the malls to bombings to, on down the line. And it's just sort of an ever-present, I don't know about anybody else, but I feel that there's much more of an ever-present sort of physical danger out there than when I was younger. It may just be I'm growing older and more cynical, I don't know, but I certainly feel that way. It feels like we live in a little bit more dangerous time. And then finally, the last one are really just disasters that affect you and maybe your family on a personal level. Things like losing your job or, having a family sickness or a disability, a tree falling, coming through your roof, things like that you didn't expect to have happen, but they still cause the same sort of things. They cause a lot of burden on your family, maybe loss of life as well. So those are sort of my 5 categories of disasters.
In your speaking about disaster preparedness, you talk about the cardinal rule of disaster preparedness. Can you talk us through what is the cardinal rule and how does it apply?
Right. So, we'll spend most of the time talking about how to prepare and some actual steps we can take in that. But I like to remind people, and I do this certainly in the handbook, before you go down the path of getting better prepared, understand the cardinal rule. And the cardinal rule is really simple. It's just that when you can get out of the way of a disaster, do get out of the way of the disaster, right? There's a lot of things people make poor decisions and they put themselves in harm's way when they had an opportunity to escape it, right? And they really have no one to blame but themselves at that point. And so a good example, again, is the hurricane approaching Florida. People have an opportunity to escape that. They know it's coming, there's no doubt, and they've had an opportunity to escape. And some will choose to leave and some will not for various reasons. And I don't fault anybody one way or the other. All I'm saying is if you have opportunities to escape a significant danger, you should take it. Now, that doesn't mean that all disasters can be gotten out of the way of. Certainly they cannot, right? Some things that happen very quickly. Some things are so widespread that you can't escape them anyway. And those are good examples of times when it's really nice to have your preparations in order.
It reminds me of a time that I was practicing judo with my daughter, and she's a second-degree black belt in karate, and I was trying to demonstrate a hold on her, and I had her in a pin, and I thought, okay, now, why isn't she struggling to get it? I said, what are you doing? She said, I'm conserving my energy. I'm not in immediate danger. I've assessed the situation. It's like, dang, I wasn't prepared for that. But sometimes avoiding the conflict is the best way to conserve your energy and to really increase your chances of survival and lower your risk rather than trying to do some heroic confronting it head on.
Yeah, that's great. And I will say there's another side to the story. There'll be people who no doubt disagree with me and think I'm saying you should always try and run away from everything that comes. And that's not really what I'm advocating. There are many times that it's safer to stay put, right? And depending on what the threat is to you, People make the opposite mistake, which is, oh, I see something coming, and me and 3 million other people are all going to try and get out of town at the same time, right?
Yeah.
And what they end up with is on the side of the road, out of gas, with nothing but 3 Snickers bars and a bottle of water in their car, and they're in trouble, right? They're in real trouble. And we saw a lot of that during other hurricanes where people are late to evacuate and things. So there are times, where you're better off. You're in a home where you've got all kind of supplies, all kind of tools, and, a shelter that's really sturdy around you. So there's many times when you should not try and get out of Dodge. I'm only pointing the obvious that, if a wildfire is coming your way, it's time to get up and get out of there before it's too late, that kind of thing.
So where does an individual family get started? What's the first steps they should take?
Yeah, so preparedness is a lot of common sense. And so I'm sure people listening to the show will say, I can find all this on the internet, or this is all just common sense. Well, what I try and do, at least in the handbook, is I try and organize sort of how do you logically go about creating a disaster preparedness plan. And I saw a lot of things. I read every disaster preparedness book on the market at the time of the writing of this. And what I found was that there was a lot of great advice. But there wasn't really like a logical step-by-step sort of how do you do it, and with some tables and examples of how preparedness looked. So that's what I tried to do. And so I boiled it down to sort of 3 steps, 3 fundamental steps that you get started with. One of them is you sit down and you figure out what it is you're worried about, right? So, for example, I live on the East Coast, and we're worried about hurricanes. We've been hit by 2 since I lived here, but we're not so worried about many other things that people might be, maybe earthquakes or other things. And so you make a list, or you or your family sit down and make a list of the kind of things you're worried about. And those could be anything from, I'm worried about my personal safety when I'm out in public, to I'm worried about electrical blackouts, or and pandemics, on down the list. Whatever really bothers you, whatever keeps you up at night, make a list of it. And that's very different for each individual. It's very different based on, if you have a family, if you live in a city, and, so each situation is different. Once you've made that list, then figure out, well, all right, if this event were to happen, so let's say you're worried about blackout. So, I'm really worried about a long-term blackout, maybe due to a solar storm. You'd say, well, what would be the likely adverse effects of that happening? Well, very likely we would lose electrical power, and then that might lead to maybe the inability to get groceries, and maybe it would lead to the inability to get gasoline for my car. And you could sort of go down the list of what the impacts of that particular threat occurring would be on you and your family. And so you sort of make a list, and there's a little table in the book about sort of how you do that, and you say, all right, these are the impacts that it's going to affect me. And then the third step is just, all very common sense. You just sort of say, okay, now for each of these impacts, I'm not going to be able to get to the grocery store and get food. What can I do to sort of mitigate that impact on me? And, maybe in that case it's, well, I could keep some shelf-stable food on hand that I wouldn't need electricity for, but at least we wouldn't go hungry, right? And so each of those impacts, you just sort of jot down the notes and the actionable steps that you and your family could take to be ready for that, to mitigate those impacts. That's sort of my 3-step process.
And in your book, you list a whole structured series of 14 basic needs. You mentioned about Maslow's hierarchy, but you also talk about the most practical needs that people have, so that it helps provide some structure or an outline to that discussion. So it isn't all just brainstorming, it's brainstorming within some guided structure.
Right. Yeah, so I break down, basically the book is a few chapters of talking about preparedness and sort of the process of preparedness. And then the rest of the chapters are 1 chapter sort of per need, per each of these 14 needs. And then the last few chapters are sort of some specialized threats that we face, and talking about how to prepare for those. So the 14 needs, just to have them sort of on record here, these are the things that sort of I identified as we need to keep us alive and that we should probably address in a preparedness plan. So I'll run through them. So there's food and water. Everybody thinks of those sort of right off the bat. There's shelter and light, heating and cooling kind of lumped together. Air, that just means to have clean air to breathe. Sleep, hygiene and sanitation, medicine and first aid, communication, power, financial security, transportation, and protection. So that's sort of the chapters of the book, but it's also sort of the topics that maybe if you were addressing these impacts, you would think about, okay, how's my communication? Am I still going to be able to receive radio broadcasts or television broadcasts to know what's going on? You could sort of address these individually.
You introduce a new term in your discussions. One, it's called stockgivalist. What in the world is that?
Yeah, that's a term I used to use a lot. I haven't used it in a while, but I do when I go and give talks, because it sort of really shows the idea of what I'm about. And I just took 3 words and stuck them together. And some of your audience, I know, will know where they come from. Stockgivalist. So the first word is stock, and that comes from the word stockpiler. And, most of the time when people think of disaster preparedness or even, that topic in general, they think of people stockpiling a lot of supplies. And that's certainly a part of being into disaster preparedness, is to store extra supplies. So stockpiler is part of it. The second piece is the MacGyver aspect of it. And I think they're redoing that on television now, but it used to be there was a show, of course, on TV called MacGyver, and it was about a guy who could sort of jury rig anything, right? You gave him a gum wrapper and, a toothpick, and he could get out of the room. He always had some way of using what it was at his disposal in a clever way to sort of accomplish the task. And the idea behind that is, many times we're faced with a situation we hadn't planned on, right? And we have a lot of things at our disposal, especially if we're in our home, and we have to figure out how to put that together in some way to solve that problem to keep us safe. And so that aspect of being sort of a MacGyver, thinking like MacGyver, is the second piece of being that stockgivalist. And then the third is just sort of a survivalist, a sort of a classic wilderness survivalist type mentality. And I always tell people, that's someone who can sort of find dinner in an old stump, that kind of thing. Somebody who is willing to sort of dig deep, in their sort of discomfort level and do what they have to do in order to survive. And combining those three, the stockpiler, being MacGyver, and the survivalist, it sort of gets you in this certain mindset of what I think about when I think of somebody being really prepared. I think they have a little bit of all of that in them.
When you've talked about different types of threats, how would people even start going about preparing for a truly massive, big event like a global pandemic or a meteor strike or an EMP attack?
Yeah, so that's usually, as odd as it is, that's where a lot of people try and start. So that maybe they read something, maybe about an EMP attack, for example, and, it's certainly a high-impact event, would have huge consequences on the United States. And so they think, all right, I'm going to start preparing for that. And the reality of it is these high-impact events, an asteroid strike or something like that, these have, global implications, and all of your needs are affected in one way or another, and they require really, really extensive preparations to survive, or certainly to do well through. And so what I like to tell people is that, that's planning for sort of the end of civilization, right? We always hear that term turn around. They're much better served by starting off small, right, by preparing for what they know is coming. You're going to get some winter storms if you live in, North Dakota. They're going to strand you for a while. And so you start, my advice to people is to start by preparing for what makes sense for sort of the likely things that happen, and get ready for those. And you'll develop some set of preparations. Maybe you'll store some food. Maybe you'll put a container of water in the garage, or whatever these preparations are. Maybe you get a generator and some spare fuel. And then you can expand those preparations for these really high-impact events once you get your sea legs under you and you understand what it means to really, tackle practical preparedness. And one reason I tell people that is I have seen people spend thousands and thousands of dollars on preparedness stuff, whether it was food or gear of various sorts, and really have never really thought out a whole plan. They're really, really prepared in one area, but they're not prepared for the other aspects of some kind of threat. And so it tells me that they didn't do their legwork first. They didn't start slow and sort of build it up and learn what they were doing. And so that's why I advocate people start slow, learn what they're doing, and then prepare for more and more as they see fit.
Why don't you talk us through, if you would, a few of those basic categories, starting with maybe the most seminal one of food. What can people do in your mind that sets them up well for preparedness to have enough food for their family?
Right. So food is, that's the number one thing I think everybody would think of when you think disaster preparedness. It perhaps is not the most important item to prepare for, but it's certainly the one that comes to mind. And, everybody's opinion on food storage and food preparation is very different. And I get a lot of flack when I give talks because my advice doesn't necessarily align with the end of the world kind of thinking. So my advice is this. I think every person in every house in the United States should have a minimum of 30 days of food in their house. And usually that's about when people start throwing things from the audience and so forth. Because many people have heard, well, I should have a year's worth of food, a year's worth of supply of food. And I have no objection to that if somebody wants to store a year's worth of food, but it is a lot of food, and you have to worry about spoilage and rotation and rodents and all kinds of other issues with it. And so I'm not saying don't do it. What I'm saying is, again, with that start small, build up, I think a 30-day supply gets you through 98% of the things that could happen to you. Most things are resolved within 30 days, even large hurricanes and earthquakes. Most things in the United States anyway, within 30 days, emergency aid is available and people can survive at that point forward. So that's sort of my how much. In terms of what to store, if you go on that premise of 30 days is sort of enough maybe, or even if you went 60 days, you can just store regular foods. You can store canned foods and boxed foods. You don't want to do too heavy on refrigerated or frozen foods because you could easily lose power depending on the threat. But so, you can store normal things. I always tell people, store what you eat what you store, right? It's not that difficult to maintain a pantry of 30 days of food. I will say, though, most people only have about 5 to 7 days of food in their house. They don't have a lot of food. So it is a lot more than what people are used to, but it's not, huge volumes of food. There is a sort of a separate category of food storage altogether, which is if you wanted to store long-term food storage. This is food that you maybe don't eat regularly, but you want to have for a really big emergency, and there's many options for that, but that's typically where people buy, freeze-dried foods or dehydrated foods. Some people even buy MREs, for example, and these are foods that typically go into like maybe a church pantry or a neighborhood pantry where you might not touch them for 10 years, right? They're just going to sit there as sort of an emergency stockpile. I don't advocate that's where people start at again, because those foods typically don't get eaten, and so people don't even know, what they taste like. A lot of times they haven't even tasted their foods, and they're maybe not as well. It's not as well thought out in terms of a food plan as maybe they should have. But that's sort of my feeling on food in general. One of the things we did in the book, just if people read in there, they'll see we did a lot of taste tests of various freeze-dried and dehydrated foods and emergency survival bars, like we bought those, the bars that you buy for if you're at sea and you get, you've got some little block of food that you can eat, and tried to sort of decipher, well, what would we really want to live on if we had to do this for a year or 6 months or sometime, and sort of tried to, got my kids involved. Everybody sort of tried to weigh in on what was really okay and what wasn't. And, it's as you'd expect, the things that are more like regular food or what people enjoy eating, and, blocks of lemon-flavored hard cake, are not things people want to eat very often. So, but anyway, that's sort of my take on food.
And in the following the rule of threes, where you can go like 3 weeks without food, but only 3 days without water, can you talk to us about options for survival water storage?
Right. So water is the one, I think, critical need that people really neglect. And I mean, even people who are into preparedness, right? I've talked to lots of folks who have, closets and closets full of food. But if you ask them, well, what's your water plan? They have a basic plan, but they don't really have a backup to it. And I don't think they really appreciate how critically important having a clean water supply is for all kinds of reasons. So I'll talk about it a little bit. The first thing you have to start with is to decide, do you want to keep water on site, right? Or do you want to have some water source external that you can go out and retrieve it and maybe purify it to use? If you're blessed with having a water source nearby that you can just purify and use, that's great. That saves a lot of trouble in terms of the storage requirements. But what I tell people is that, realistically, you can't store like a year's worth of water unless you have massive tanks or something like that. In the United States, we being wasteful of water, we use about 100 gallons per person per day. So I got a family of 6. That's 600 gallons a day if we didn't change our water consumption, and that it's just not feasible to store for any length of time at all. So what I tell people is you have to get used to, if you're going to store water, you have to think totally different than what you do in daily life. You have to think about, rinsing off with cups, poured over your head, and you have to think about, just sort of the critical needs of water, which is staying clean, hydrating your food, and keeping yourself hydrated in general, and with some potable water. And most of the time I say that's about 2 gallons per day per person at a minimum. And I think FEMA recommends a gallon a day, but realistically it ends up being more than that by the time you try and keep, the important is you don't get sick when you're in a disaster. And so keeping yourself clean and your dishes clean and other things that you're using is very important. So I say 2 gallons per day, and I recommend that people, if they're going to store water, store a minimum of 14 days. And so you can figure that's about 28 gallons a person. For a family of 5, that's about 140 gallons of water. It's a reasonable amount to stockpile in your garage. You can buy tanks, polyethylene tanks that aren't that obtrusive. You can put in your garage, and they'll store a few hundred gallons without any trouble. So in terms of potable water, that's sort of my entry point into it. Now, the other, of course, need for water that people often forget about is for sanitation, right? Everybody's got to go to the bathroom, and you got to figure out how you're going to handle that. And if you have no water, if you've ever been in a situation where toilets aren't running any longer, that gets to you quickly, right? You realize just how dire that is. When we had a hurricane hit here, Hurricane Isabel hit, we went and stayed with my brother, and again, to get out of the way. And unfortunately, he was on well water, and they lost power, and he couldn't run his well. He didn't have a backup system. So we were out hunting water, not to drink. We had bottled water, but to refill the commodes by which we could keep the sanitation and keep the toilets flushing. So that's another thing is that people need to think about, is there, like our neighbor has a swimming pool. We're going to use his swimming pool. If we need to keep our toilets running, we'll go get water out of the swimming pool. But identifying a source, each flush might take 3 gallons of water. So you have to identify a source of using numerous gallons, maybe 30, 40, 50 gallons in a day, just kind of keeping toilets if you're going to use toilets. Of course, there are other options for sanitation besides toilets. You can certainly create an outhouse kind of situation. You can have compost toilets and other things. But most people, they prefer not to go dig a hole outside. They try and keep their toilets running. So that's another aspect of water that I think, often gets overlooked. And so if we talk about water, one thing that always comes up is, well, if I store water, how long is it going to last, right? I mean, the answer is it depends. It depends greatly on the conditions of the water you store and the condition of the environment in which you store it. So ideally, I always tell people if you store tanks of water, you should change it at least once a year. I always change mine every 6 months just because I worry about bacteria getting in the water.
Yeah, that would be a horrible situation if you counted on it. You've got a store of water, but then you find that it's tainted by the time you need to use it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And then everybody's getting sick with dysentery and other things, and then you're in really bad shape because you're losing water that much faster, right? So I tell everybody 6 months to a year, you change out your water. You can treat water. There's some water treatment you can buy. You can put extra bleach in the water. But realistically, you don't need to do that. Most all municipal water is already treated. What you really need to do is just cycle it. You occasionally cycle it because external contaminants can get in the water. So that's the answer to that. Now, in terms of bottled water, interestingly enough, there is no real expiration date on bottled water. The way that it's sealed is very pure. The conditions are very pure. So you can keep bottled water essentially indefinitely, certainly for many years, and it still be safe to drink. There's a lot of misinformation about, it only lasts a year or something like that, and that's not true at all. So that's the good news about bottled water.
That is the freshness dating they've got. I've paid a lot of attention to this over the last few years. It's usually a year and a half or 2 years from the date of bottling to where it says it's fresh through. But you're saying that's just a convention they're following.
Yeah, the freshness, is much like it's sort of like a taste freshness, right? Water will start to taste sort of flat if it sits too long, and so what the water bottlers are doing is saying, hey, you want to get our best product, it's freshest when you drink it by these following dates, but I'm only talking in terms of safety. And so in terms of safety, and you can look this up through the FDA and so forth, there is essentially no expiration on bottled water. And I don't know when the realistic end date is. Again, it probably depends on how you stored it, under what temperature and all those conditions. What I will say is it's many years, and so nobody should be throwing out unopened bottled water just because it's past the freshness date or something like that.
Are you informed of or aware of any of the concerns that people have about storing in plastic containers, specifically about BPAs and what they would consider estrogenic compounds that can leach out of plastic into the water, especially if there's thermal cycling or over periods of time? Yeah, so I certainly have seen the news on that as well, and I know a lot of the new plastic containers, are supposed to be free of that. And I don't, I'm not somebody who studies water in that sense. I don't know how real that threat was to people. I know for years and years we used plastic bottles that, were not safe in that regard, and, the danger seemed pretty minimal. But I don't want to discount it because the person who does come down with cancer or some other illness from that would say, hey, clearly, he's not giving me justice here. All I will say is I think
in the bigger scheme of threats facing you, that's probably on the lower part of the list. Even if you had older plastic containers, it just wouldn't be something that I was worrying about when I was really thirsty. With that said, if I were going to buy new storage tanks and so forth, I would do my homework and make sure that they were BPA free and make sure that, it was as safe as I possibly could have for just those reasons.
What about variety of storage containers? You've mentioned large tanks. You've also mentioned bottles. Is there a virtue in having a variety or diversity of sizes of storage containers?
Yeah, I think it's very important. In fact, I have for example, we have a tank in the garage that we keep sort of our regular water storage in, but we also have 6 of the, I guess they're about 6-gallon jerry cans, plastic jerry cans, which, we just got at Home Depot. They're meant for water storage. And the reason I did that is exactly what you're saying, is that, there's some disasters we talked about earlier. You need to get out of its way. You got to get out of there. And so you certainly can't take your tank with you. And so what I can do is fill up those jerry cans, throw a handful of those in the back of the van, and be on our way, and at least have, some potable water that I know is safe to drink as I go. So I do think it's important that you have portable containers for that reason, as well as if you have to go retrieve water from somewhere, you have to have some containers by which you can retrieve it in. So I do think various sizes are important, yeah.
And if you do retrieve water that you need to purify, what are the variety of options that you talk about in your book for how people can purify the water?
Yes, I got really into water purification for a while, and anybody who reads the book will see that. So I got like every kind of water purifier known to man, just about, and every technique of purifying water. And I was trying to figure out through research and through my own sort of investigations, what was sort of the optimal way. I wanted the one best way. And what I discovered is all of them have trades. They're good and bads. And I have a table in the book that sort of, shows those. But the normal methods, the sort of commonplace ways of purifying water, are either boiling it, right? And boiling is great. If you have the heat source, you can kill all pathogens by boiling the water, right? So all the parasites that you're worried about, bacteria and viruses, all of them you can kill with boiling if you boil it. So that's great. Now, it doesn't, unfortunately, take out chemicals. It doesn't remove, residue and debris from water. If you pulled it from a river or something, it's not going to make it taste any better, really. So it has its limitations. And of course,
and in 2014, in the Northwest Ohio and southeastern Michigan area, where the Maumee River and Port Clinton River were emptying into Lake Erie, there was these algal blooms that created these mycotoxins in the water. And even though it was a biologic source, the nature of the hazard was not the living organisms, which could be killed by boiling. The nature of the hazard was their chemical wastes that they left in the water. And the recommendation of the health authorities there was, do not boil the water. It will only further make the chemical hazard more potent.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting. So that's the sort of the weakness of boiling as a whole. Above and beyond boiling, of course, you can get you a high quality filter or water purifier, and I have several, and there are lots of good ones out there that people can look at. I always say that you want to look at the absolute pore size of the filter. It should never be more than 1 micron. And nowadays they have lots of submicron water filters and purifiers, and the reason is, of course, you want the membrane to be as fine as possible, so that these particulates and these bacteria and so forth will be blocked by the membrane. And so the smaller and the finer it is, the better. And you want to look at the absolute pore size, not like an average or nominal pore size, because you don't want any holes in the membrane that would allow it through either. So there's lots of great filters. We have a general ecology one called a Seagull 4 here at our house, which is one of the best. I really like it. A really good purifier, and it will prevent bacteria, it will prevent parasites, and it will even prevent some viruses. And that's sort of the screening mechanism. Viruses are very, very, very small, and so it's difficult to prevent them and to block them in your water system. But there are some that do, and so if you can find a certified purifier, certified water purifier, they're actually certified to some level against all 3 of those. And so people have to do their homework and find the ones that work for them. But certainly water filters and purifiers are great, And then it just sort of gets a little more difficult from there down. You can use chemicals. And certainly in emergencies, people do all the time. They use bleach or iodine to purify their water. And I will tell you, as part of our taste testing experiment, Of the two, bleach-treated water is far better than iodine-treated water.
Right.
If you've ever tasted it, you know what I'm talking about. Iodine-treated water is almost undrinkable because the odor is so powerful. Iodine has a very strong odor. And so my kids couldn't drink it at all. Now, maybe if they were dying of dehydration, they would, but it's last resort kind of thing. And even chemicals, they take a great deal of, sometimes hours, to purify water, and they only purify against certain things depending on what concentrations you use and so forth. So it's not a surefire, take care of anything. Above and beyond that, we have distillation. You can buy water distillers. We have one, we plug in and it can distill water. And distillation is great because it essentially, you can get rid of any contaminants because it essentially evaporates out the water and collects the condensation, and you have pure H2O. You can get rid of chemicals as well that way.
Right.
And so distillation is a really nice way. The problem with distillation is it's very slow, and it takes a heat source again, which in some disasters you just don't have. So that's the drawback of that. And then the other one is reverse osmosis. You can buy that for your home, for example. They have a reverse osmosis systems that are whole house systems. And those work very well, too. They remove all of the contaminants as well. They can remove viruses and so forth, and even chemicals. The disadvantage of them is they're very wasteful. They're expensive, typically, to get put in. And so for many people, it's not a practical solution, but it is very effective. And the one that I've seen a lot lately is they sell a lot of these UV light pens and ultraviolet methods of killing pathogens and so forth in your water. And those are kind of neat. I've got one of those little SteriPens, where you stir your water up. You've probably seen like the little hiking. And according to the data, and they publish the data of what they've done, it looks like it does a pretty good job. Like within a minute or two, you stir your water with this thing. The UV light essentially renders everything inert, and you can drink it. And I view those as more like a small, like for on a small sample, you can do a cup or two at a time. But it's not meant for like your whole family. It's not really conducive to that very easily. So that's sort of the gamut of different ways of purifying water. All of those have, goods and bads, and it's way too much to talk about in any, single conversation. The one thing I would tell people is don't forget the importance of the taste of the water. I only learned that from experience. You can always think, I'm going to go out to the lake out there and scoop me up some water and boil it, and I'm going to drink that stuff down. But that's hard to do. So don't forget that, and that's one advantage of really good purifiers and filters is they really help the quality in terms of the taste of the water as well.
Yeah, and in that allusion, you were referring to the source of the water. So if someone doesn't live right near a lake or a river, what are some creative sources of water that people should consider?
Yeah, so that's great. So, many times we're in a situation where we're really dire straits, and I call it sort of natural collection, where you're just trying to pull water from your environment, right? And if you're in your home, the single biggest source is your hot water heater, right? And so everyone should know how to drain their hot water heater. I've taught my wife how to do it. It's not hard to do. There's a little valve at the top. There's a valve at the bottom, and so go through it one time and know how to drain your hot water heater, because that might store, ours is, I don't know, around 100 gallons or so. That's a lot of water, in case of an emergency. Beyond your hot water heater, then you got to get a little more creative. So some of the natural collection methods are like trying to collect rainwater. For example, you can use tarps, a kid's swimming pool, and hang sheets out the window and let them get soaked and pull them in and wring them into buckets. That's sort of collecting, what God's providing, right? There are other clever ways. If you live somewhere where it's cold, of course, you can go out and gather snow. Snow melts like 10 to 1. So, if you gather a bucket, you're not going to get that much of it, but you'll get some. And then what I like to tell people is one way to do is to maybe scoop up a pillowcase full, bring it in and just hang it over a bucket and let the air warm it, and it'll drip through the end of the pillowcase into the bucket. Kind of gives it a little filtration as well. There's dew collection. That's actually one of my very favorites. And the idea of this is to get up early when there's still dew on the plants, and this, of course, works well if you have a lot of foliage, and then just take a rag and a bucket and wipe off the plants and wring it out into the bucket and keep doing that. And it's amazing. Within an hour, you could, with a bit of hard work, a couple people can fill a 5-gallon bucket.
You might not believe this, but I actually see dew collection happening every morning because we take our Rottweiler mix out for a walk, and he was an unclaimed stray when we got him. We were convinced, and our obedience trainer is convinced this is how he survived in the wild, because he'll go along like a hound dog with his nose to the ground, but his tongue's hanging out, and he's dragging that tongue across that wet grass and just slopping it up. We tell him not to, because some of the neighbors spray with chemicals, and we don't want him getting that. But it's definitely there.
That is the worry, right? Yeah, you're right. The dew collection, the worry is you don't know what you're putting in, right? You can always filter it, but again, there's limitations on what you can take out. You're absolutely right about that. And the last two are maybe some of the more popular ones. There's something called transpiration bags, which are really just taking clear plastic bags and tying them around foliage, maybe branches of trees with lots of green and so forth. And you have to snug them up really tight around the branch so that you essentially don't want any air escaping. And they act as a little greenhouse around that foliage, and they evaporate the water out, and it collects in the bottom of the clear bag. The only thing I'll warn people about that is if you go out and try it, and it's worth trying, you may kill the plant because it can be kind of hard on the plant when you do that. But it's easy to do. You tie up 10 of them on different plants, and you come back 12 hours later and see what you got. And then the last one are solar stills, which probably is the most famous of all in terms of natural collection, and that's where people dig a hole, maybe 3 feet across, maybe a couple of feet deep. You put a collection cup in the bottom, and you put a clear plastic cover over the top, and seal it up with dirt or rocks around the outside, and put a little rock in the center to give it like a funnel shape. And again, it acts as a greenhouse. People can put plants in there. You can even have urine in there. Whatever it is, it evaporates out that water and drips it into the cup. And I've tried those. I've built solar stills before with mixed luck. What I will say is that do not think that it is a trivial job that, if I need one, I'll just go out and build one. If you've never done it before, you probably will not have success with it. So if you're going to rely on it, you should have tried it a couple of times and understand, the difficulties of getting it to work and the tricks and so forth to make it give you the optimal amount of water.
Well, Dr. Bradley, we'd like to also proceed on to the topic of electricity, because a lot of the ideas that you mentioned are more easy to do if you have electric power, and so many other aspects of our lives and the things you mentioned in your list, like heat, light, communication, can be assisted by electric power. But we're out of time for this interview. We'd love to have you back again, though, so we can continue on and talk to us about the different options, sources, and trade-offs for how you can maintain electric power in the case of a disaster.
Yeah, that sounds great. Maybe the next time we can talk about a handful of some of the other particular preparations that people can make.
That'd be great, and thank you very much for joining us here again on Reluctant Preppers. Is there any last thought that you would like to leave with our audience on the topics that we already covered?
Well, the only thing I'll say is that everybody should remember that we're all in this together, right? And so it's real easy to turn our attention inward when we're thinking about disaster preparedness, when we're thinking about our family safety, but also think about your neighbors and think about your friends and family and how you might be able to work together as part of a network. I find that we're much stronger if we're able to work as part of a group.
How true. And if people want to find more of your writings and more of your work online, where can they find you?
Yeah, they can go to my website. It's disasterpreparer.com. They can also just search Arthur Bradley on the web, and they'll find me.
Excellent. Dr. Arthur T. Bradley, author of the Disaster Preparedness Handbook and many other writings as well, speaker on preparedness. Thank you for joining us on Reluctant Preppers.
Thank you very much.